try it anyway, and fingers crossed. And if we have to rearrange, I'll do my best to
No,
find a
thanks.
window for you.
Thanks, Matt. It's worth trying anything once, they say, apart from Morris dancing.
I've never done Morris dancing. Well, welcome to the latest edition of the Humana podcast with me, Chris, and my good friend.
Oh, that's me, I'm guessing.
You.
Hello, Chris. And we're joined today by a very, very special guest. It's not always about guests on this podcast, but we had a unique opportunity to interview someone with a very particular lens on the world. Ben, would you mind introducing yourself for our wonderful audience?
Yeah, of course. It's great to be here. My name is Ben Jacobs. I'm a sports broadcaster. I work with TalkSport as a Premier League commentator. I report on transfers and takeovers. Previously with CBS, beIN Sports, BBC. Basically, I get paid to talk for a living. So if it turns out that I'm rubbish on this podcast, then I'm obviously bad at my job.
I often describe my job as being paid to talk, so that's quite fair, but it's a very different spin on it from your side.
Ben, we're super excited that you're here to join us. I know it's a really busy time for you because we're right in the midst of the football transfer window in the UK, and I know that takes up a lot of your time. So thank you for finding the time to do it. For those who don't know, kind of give it to us in really simple terms. What is a sports broadcaster and journalist? What's kind of the crux of your day to day?
I think the day to day is a lot of coffee and not much sleep, a lot of talking to people on air and off air as well. But it's essentially about, as you do in life, building relationships. And people think that we're there to get the story. So we're news hounds. We're constantly lurking in the corners of hotel lobbies or training grounds, waiting to bump into people and get our stories or spot things. But the reality is that you got to think people first, story second. So you build up relationships, and that allows you to know who to speak to. It might be a player's agent, it might be an executive, it might be someone at a football club, it might be someone you've met in a coffee shop. But if you start treating people as sources and things as stories, then that doesn't give you a process. And instead, if you take the time to be genuine with people and build relationships, then eventually that pays off. And who knows, that young person you met in a coffee shop that wants to own a football club in 10 years might do so. And that might allow you a so-called source. But I don't like the word source simply because if all you're trying to do is milk information, then you're not being genuine, you're not living in the present, and that's going to be detrimental to you getting stories. So my day-to-day is just about being places, being present in the moment, having conversations, putting scrutiny on those conversations, and then trying to report things on air or in writing or on social media with as much balance as possible.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of ruined my myth, really, of what journalists really do then. So you tell me you don't turn up in comedy mustache and glasses and a secret disguise and jab out of bushes at people.
There's maybe been the odd occasion where I've used a menu like you sometimes see in the movies to raise above my face so they can't see I'm there and eavesdrop. But generally, I think we get a bad rap as journalists because people think we're news hounds. People think we somehow don't have morals. If it was Harry Potter, we'd be in the house of Slytherin, and some of us are nice people.
That's an interesting take on it as well. I think the media and movies and stuff portray journalism definitely as bad guys or seedy or however you want to frame it. I'm guessing that's not why you got into journalism as a kid, though. Do you mind maybe explaining your kind of origin story, as it were? How did you get into the profession?
So I wanted to be a footballer. I was rubbish. I wasn't big enough, strong enough, fast enough. I was like a showboater, though. I could do a million kick-ups, but just about nothing else. So it got to a point after being rejected by a local side in Leicestershire called Oadby Owls that I realised that my only real skill was opening my mouth. And some would still say that that's not my skill, but I enjoy it. And if you're paid to do it, keep going. That's what I always say. Don't look at life through the lens of what others think about how good or bad you are. Ultimately, if you're getting paid to do it and it's a job and it's a dream, then go for it and make sure that you do it with a smile on your face. So my dad is a dentist and he treated a lot of the Leicester players. And one of them was a very unknown goalkeeper called Carl Muggleton. And one day, Dad asked Carl Muggleton if I could be mascot for Leicester, and he sorted it out for a second division game, like a reserve team game. And in my memory, being only age 6 or 7, there were like 25,000 people there, but actually there was just a few hundred. And I kicked the ball on the pitch, and Muggleton actually, based on photographic evidence, was the one that nudged the ball into the goal. So I used to tell a story as a kid saying how I scored against my hero, Carl Muggleton, at Filbert Street. But when I watch it back, I didn't kick it hard enough, and he basically just nudged it in to give me the self-validation that I'd scored a goal at Filbert Street. And then from there, Dad also used to go on BBC Leicester and do a dental phone-in where people would call him up and ask what to do about their toothache. So he asked Radio Leicester if I could come in and do work experience, and I made tea and I answered the phones, and I stayed ever since. And that got me a foot in. And then flash forwards, I went to Oxford, and I used the BBC connection when I studied English at university to ask if I could go from BBC Leicester to BBC Oxford, still unpaid, still answering phones. But crucially, when I was about 19 in my second year of university, I was sent out to a local game to go and cover Oxfordshire football and do a match report. And that again gave me an in. So then when I finished university, I had some BBC ins, I had some experience reporting, and I stayed in it ever since. And from there, I commentated on Rushden and Diamonds for BBC Northampton. I moved over to a commercial station in Reading, and I was the Premier League commentator for them. This was after university. And then I started my path into TV journalism. I ended up at CBS. And now I'm back in Premier League commentary with TalkSport and freelancing, doing various other things. And I've been able to build my own brand too. So it's not just about working for an employer. It's about also trying to be your own brand, which is the advantage of being freelance. And that's allowed me to build an audience on social media and have a bit more freedom and have a little bit more of a work-life balance.
I love that. And I think what I'm really curious to understand, Ben, obviously it sounds like your right place, right time is amazing, but you've obviously worked to put yourself in that right place, that right time. I've seen, and from following you and kind of looking on your website and stuff, you've interacted with some of the biggest names in sporting history, not just modern times, but in sporting history. So with that, being kind of thrust into the situation that you're in and meeting some of these people and interviewing some of these people you have you ever kind of doubted yourself, like, I don't deserve to be here, or I don't know what I'm doing? Kind of, I don't know, it's like imposter syndrome type thing. Has that ever been a thing that's crossed your mind?
I think it always is. And in a weird way, the imposter syndrome never goes away because you back yourself to do something, but the media is ever changing. So the big advantage to a young journalist is that they graduate with all of the new tools. So most journalists, unlike me, 10, 12 years ago, can edit, can use TikTok and other social media, can self-shoot. So now if you're employing a young journalist to, let's say, the press conference, which I'm on my way back from, then you need one person because they'll be able to write and transcribe. They'll be able to put something on your social media. They might be able to make a graphic. They'll be able to edit. So they're in a brilliant position, and they can actually get ahead of some of the older people in the industry because their skill set is more developed, diverse, and ultimately modern. But when I first started, the imposter syndrome came for the same reasons, because I was entering into a media landscape where most had gone through arts and not journalism. And in fairness, I'd done the same. My English degree was based upon the fact that the older generation had told me don't go and do media studies, whereas now it's very much do. And the journalism courses are endorsed by the likes of the BBC and ITV, and they're excellent, particularly in places like Cardiff and UCL. So the landscape constantly changes, and you'll always have that imposter syndrome unless you feel like you can adapt. And when I first started, it was just at the beginning of the sort of Twitters and the digital age. So all the old people at the BBC were used to editing, believe it or not, using sticky tape and what we used to call a yellow crayon. And you'd mark your edits with this crayon, and you'd take a razor blade and you'd cut it, and then you'd tape it all up. And then suddenly, within a year or two, the digital age came in. And I would imagine a lot of people that were used to doing it the manual, old school way felt like they had to adapt as well. For me, it was more just feeling like, how can I prove that I'm good enough without the experience? And it's chicken and egg. And who's going to give me that opportunity? And as I said before, in the end, I got my opportunity out of luck, really, despite trying to network and do work experience and make tea and listen and learn and take meetings, I got my experience just completely out of the blue. And then you've proven you can do it on the job. And then you'll have other instances of imposter syndrome where maybe you're just dealing with people that are very forthright. They're used to doing it one way. And football can be quite closed and intimidating. So you get put in front of a name for the first time, and maybe they take issue with your question, and immediately you doubt yourself that you're in the wrong, when actually perhaps you've asked a very valid question and they're the ones that have got a problem, or they're the ones that are fueled by a bad result. So you kind of have to learn to take a lot of things on the chin and realize that if your process is right and your training is right, and if you listen and learn, there will be instances where you doubt yourself. I remember Leicester, my team, so I had a soft spot for them, played Leeds United, and it was a 1-1 draw at Ellen Road many years ago, and I was there for 5 Live, and because we were the radio partner, I got the first real opportunity to interview at the time the manager, Nigel Pearson. And I thought, wow, I'm so excited to interview the Leicester City manager. And let me just preface this by saying Nigel Pearson is one of the best in the business. He's a lovely guy. I've since worked with him repeatedly when I was at BN Sports and he flew over the Middle East. So I've got nothing but great things to say about him. But in that game, Leeds United equalised in the last minute and it was a 1-1 draw. So I asked Nigel what I thought was a very normal question. Is that a case of a point gained because you're away at Ellen Road and they're a good team? Or is it a case of 2 points dropped because you've just conceded in the last minute? And Pearson looked at me and he went, neither. What a dumb question. And immediately I panicked because I didn't know what my next question was. And I could tell that he was irritated by the result and didn't want to do any media. But in hindsight, it was not a bad question. Maybe what I should have done is been a bit more political and said, Nigel, what did you think of the game? And sometimes as a journalist, you don't need to ask a question so much as just give someone a platform when they are filled with emotion because they want to say something. But I decided to try and show off a little bit more knowledge and frame things in a more specific way. And maybe he took issue with that. And therefore, I doubted myself and thought that I'd somehow screwed up a relationship with the club that I loved as a kid, and he was never going to speak to me again. Of course, that's not what happened. And I'm in no way making out that Pearson was wrong in how he dealt with the situation, because sometimes as journalists we do ask stupid questions, but that's where the imposter syndrome can kick in, and you can almost feel afraid the next time you get the opportunity to ask a question or take an opinion. And when I was at Rushden and Diamonds, there was another manager called Barry Hunter who hated me to begin with because I would always ask the difficult questions. And over time, we developed a real love-hate relationship, and then we were friends. And it ended up at the end of a long period at Rushden and Diamonds that his opinion on me perhaps changed. And we grew to like each other, and we had a lot of banter and jokes. And every time he saw me, he'd come over and speak to me, and he'd have a laugh about what I wore, because I'd always wear these bright coloured tops or ridiculous shoes to stand out. And we became the best of friends at that point at Rushden and Diamonds. So things can change very quickly, but they're not going to change again unless you make that effort to develop the personal relationships and try, even though it can be hard at times, not to doubt yourself.
I want to kind of zone in a bit on, because there's some really interesting stuff. We could go in lots of different directions, but I think as I sit here and listen to the way you're talking about not just journalism, but actually the sports journalism side of things, it occurs to me it's a very male-orientated environment that you're in anyway. The podcast this podcast is about, our lens and how we look at masculinity. And actually, one of the questions we'll probably start with that is how you view masculinity, and I guess where that comes from, and where when you were a child or when you were growing up, how do you think being a man was sort of framed to you, and how did you learn what masculinity is?
Yeah, I think in the context of football, masculinity plays a big role, and we need to address that in many ways because football now has to be a safe space. And as a profession, we have to make sure that we promote equality and give everybody fair opportunities, and of course promote the women's game as well. And all of that is changing. But when I grew up, football was very much about going and watching the men's team. There wasn't a women's Leicester City team at that point in a functional professional league. So you would go in a largely male-orientated environment. my dad would take me. We were season ticket holders. We'd go to the rugby as well. And I think my sense of masculinity was about football being predominantly male and the terraces being a way that men could bond together and chant together and celebrate together. And I always wanted to be in the pub afterwards and wondered why at the age of 7, 8 or 9, I could only drink Coca-Cola. And I loved that collectiveness and that sort of male roar that now actually I kind of hate. So my perspective of masculinity has changed because as a kid, I naively thought that your dad took you to football and that you chanted with men and you celebrated with men and it was predominantly males. And my sister went, but she'd know nothing about football. And let me preface, this is very much naive 8-year-old me. And I'm kind of a bit disgusted now looking back that that was my default. Now, luckily for me, my parents had the opposite perspective and they were very much like, men and women play football, men and women attend football, men and women are equal. And in the football environment, it has to be safe and family friendly. So they were educating completely different to what I perceived. But you got to bear in mind that 8-year-old me wants to be a professional footballer and thinks that men are better than women, boys are better than girls, because this is just what young kids do. But that's exactly the cultural stigma that we have to remove. Like, it was almost default and nonchalant to say that. Whereas now it should be absolutely the opposite. And I've taken great pains in my professional career and in my adulthood to change my definition, which kind of did come through sport, of masculinity, and say, hang on a minute, this should be about promoting men and women, celebrating men and women, giving men and women equal opportunities in and outside of sport. So when I was in a privileged position to be in media, I was a founding member of this charity called Equal Playing Field, which basically started from 2 of my friends, one of which I went to university with, to intentionally stage world records that women broke in football in order to create a media platform to shine a light on gender equality or inequality, whichever way you want to look at it. So we climbed Kilimanjaro, and with 60 professional footballers, we staged the highest ever football match on Mount Kilimanjaro, and I made a documentary of that. Then we went to the Dead Sea and we worked with the Prince of Jordan to found a football field that's still there now in a relatively impoverished community at the lowest point of Earth. And again, we played the lowest ever football match. And then in Lyon for the Women's World Cup, we did the longest, almost continuous ever five-a-side football match. So 3 world records, and there'll be more to come. And it was all with an aim to get media to be talking about why we have these default positions, that masculinity is dominant in sport. Masculinity is about boys playing football. Masculinity is about a bunch of men in a pub. And as long as you've got that, it's very archaic, it's very old school, but more importantly, it damages the possibility for a young woman or girl, even if they're younger, to feel like there's that open door. And it's all very well sort of saying right now, if you only look at the professional game, the women's product is one, the men's is another. They work together, but they're different and they're separate. And a lot of people like the fact in the women's game that it's the opposite. It's more female predominant. It's more inclusive. The players are more accessible. There's a lot of things the men's game can take from the women's game. And it is very easy to look at that end product in the professional game and judge it now and look at how things are developing. But the bottom line is, in and outside of sport, if your base definition of masculinity doesn't accept that it's tied to femininity and loads of other things, then you're never going to have that open door for children to feel they can do anything in a safe space. And sport is particularly important. And I'm not going to stand here and talk about other professions that I have no knowledge of. But sport's so important because if from day one, a boy, a girl, anybody, whatever they identify with, doesn't feel safe, that there's a place for them, that's development for them, then whatever direction they go in, there's a danger that they'll be scarred by that. And sport, and football in particular, when I was growing up, was too rigid in its definitions of what you could and couldn't do and what each sex could do. And whether directly or indirectly, that can then have a benefit or a detriment to one sex or the other sex, depending on whether you were the one that got more or less opportunities. But regardless of if you benefited or not, and I probably did as a child, there's a danger that it shapes your cultural experience, and then you take that perception and experience of masculinity, in this case, outside of sports. And it's really important, therefore, as an adult, I think, to redefine your definition of masculinity rather than assume that what you learned as a kid was the right definition, even if you benefited from that environment.
Can I ask you something as someone who you're clearly an advocate for women and a more sort of equal playing field? I think one of the challenges, me and Chris have talked about this before, like that one of the challenges of even addressing it and talking about it is that I have a deep-rooted fear that I will be criticised because I am a man trying to put myself in a woman's position and describe it in that way and lift up women in that sense. Is that something you've encountered on your journey of talking about and elevating and actually leveling the playing field between men and women?
Not necessarily, because what I'm not saying is just that women should have opportunities, which could be deemed as empty words or patronizing. You know, I've got the opportunity and I'm saying, wouldn't equality be great? I'm fighting for it practically. So for me, it comes down to opportunity, equality, and respect. These are the three key words. Opportunity might mean me stepping aside or mentoring. I think that the male sports dynamic is still ratio-wise between men and women in a position where work needs to be done. And therefore, when you're thinking about boards or when you're thinking about demographics of anything, projects that you're working upon, it's really important to be reflective, not just of men and women, but all demographics. So just because someone offers you something, maybe there's somebody better. And I'm not saying that that's only a female, but you have to think in these broad terms to make sure that we're not just looking at male, white, middle class, in my case, Oxford educated. And if that takes me out of a non-executive board position, or if that takes me away from something I want to do, but for the benefit of that project, you have to think very deeply about that to make sure that you're not just self-serving and self-centered. And then away from only opportunity, equality is something that I agree with you. A white middle class man can't just sit there and bang on about. So you have to listen to other voices and you have to think practically about how you can get that equality. So when we start equal playing field, we break the world records to give women the media platform. So I'm helping and I'm producing a documentary in the case of Kilimanjaro, but that doesn't mean that I'm front and center. That doesn't even mean that I'm using my voice. I'm just helping raise others to use their voice. An equal playing field is also about finding funding, and it's about providing a network, and it's about working out where there's jobs on the market. So the equality is not just a word you say, the equality is something you've got to show in practice. And that again might mean stepping back, because it's much better that those voices that feel inequality get the opportunity to impact and rectify the situation rather than just me rambling on about it, which might sound wonderful and all the right things, but then at the end of it, have we actually created any meaningful change? And Gianni Infantino has spoken many times, the FIFA president, and every time he speaks about equality, he says, I've got daughters, which for me is a ridiculous thing to say. Now, in fairness to Infantino, I'm not saying he doesn't do things for women or find funding for women. He's at the top of the FIFA pyramid. But so often we hear people say, well, I'm in favor of equality. I've got a mother. I've got daughters. And that's clearly not enough. It's the most basic, almost farcical thing that you can say. So actions speak louder than words. And then with respect, I think it's the most important thing, because when we go on social media, we know that not just men, women, but lots of different topics. There is a lot of backlash. There's a lot of trolling. There's a lot of anonymous people that want to shout people down. And it isn't just men and women, and it isn't just people from different backgrounds and races. It can be as simple as even me as a transfer journalist. I put a bit of news out there, more people want to shout it down than raise the news up or amplify it, and that's the reality. And then again, with strategy and with sport growing to a point of equality that will help women and help people of all different backgrounds and races, you have to start from the bottom up. So it's very easy to say right now, men and women, why would you pay them the same if the male audience is X and the female audience is Y, and the male income is X and the female audience and income is Y? Why would you raise them level? But that's looking at it from top down, not bottom up. And obviously, if you look at the history of women's football being banned for so long, and if you look at how to get the women's game or to get people from different races and backgrounds to a certain level of equality, you have to start from the belief that they all need equal tools. So that's a very much a grassroots thing. And if you're not, to begin with, opening up coaching to everyone, opening up access to everyone, opening up education to everyone, opening up funding to everyone, opening up media to everyone, opening up exposure to everyone, you're never going to get there. So, of course, to get to equality, it's not an overnight thing. But if you only look at it at the top and say, well, one product's better than another, or one level of experience is better than another, or one attendance is better than another, or one person's CV is better than another, then you're never going to get there. Whereas if you start at the very bottom and say, well, what about giving people opportunities? What about listening to people and understanding why they feel at a disadvantage? What about trialing and changing things? What about having specific programs for specific sexes or races? And then that might lead to the catalyst that eventually gets where we need to be, where we're not even talking about men and women or people of different backgrounds, religions or races, because everyone's just in a job, everyone's just in a career, everyone's just in a personal position where we forget because culture changes. And I know that sounds very idealistic. And like I say, we're not going to get there overnight, but we're not going to get there at all unless we address the problem from a foundational, grassroots up level, rather than looking at what we've got now, particularly in sport, and saying, well, why should we bother? Because one's better than the other. And that, first of all, that's not true. And second of all, it's very kind of impatient to say, well, I don't care because I like one thing and I don't like the other thing. And I'm not prepared to invest the time and the energy and effort to try and provoke any change.
Yeah, makes sense. And I just want to touch on that point you mentioned around social media. I find this really interesting because I follow you on Twitter, X, and I regularly follow a lot of sports journalists to try and keep up to date with the transfer rumors and all this sort of stuff. And I've got no doubt every time you or your fellow colleagues put something out, you're absolutely hammered with people shouting you down and saying that's not true, you don't know what you're doing. People feel like they've got free reign on social media to kind of say what they want with no consequence. How do you deal with that, just as a human being, with people, I don't know, putting into doubt your credibility or questioning, you know what you're doing? Is that something that, does it bother you? Do you let it wash over you? How do you kind of deal with that stuff?
I think I'm a believer in reading and engaging. So you do see the criticism, and some of it, as you say, is faceless or personal and has nothing to do with your work. And unfortunately, as a journalist, we will always protect sources. So it's rarer that you would have a story where you're saying, okay, this person says this on record, and then right or wrong, nobody can deny that you got the interview. So people presume, therefore, that the journalist is gathering info, but they will always question, and we will never reveal a source unless they're prepared to go on record. So if you get something wrong, or even if you get something right, it lends people towards criticism. And when I had like 20 or 50,000 followers, I felt it was the sweet spot of people that really wanted to follow me. But now I've got 350,000 followers. I would say 300,000 of them are probably just there waiting to try and shout you down. And there's a real good news, bad news mentality. So if I give good news about a club, then it will be celebrated and blindly believed as correct. And if I give bad news about a club, you'll get hammered, even if it proves to be correct. And as a journalist, you have to ignore the noise and you have to back yourself and your sources and try not to get sucked in by the trolls. But the reality is they exist. And every single day, you'll get called a swear word or a fraud, or you'll get questioned with your information. And then, of course, if you're right and you come back to those comments, they're very quickly deleted, and that anonymous troll goes and hides in the corner. So you do have to be thick-skinned, but we also need to change the way people look at social media, because we're sort of sitting ducks, because a journalist is kind of a messenger, right? Now, we're self-appointed, we want to be there, but if the message you put out there, having put scrutiny on your sources that you believe to be correct and balanced, proves to be wrong or proves to be disputed or gets shot down, even if you're right, then there is a very realistic possibility that you're going to get absolutely hammered on social media. And I think it eats away at you at times, and it can lead to self-doubt, but you just have to back the fact that your information is correct. And I also always say to young journalists, if you don't have a process and you rush putting out info and then you're wrong, then your process has been exposed. And as much as I don't endorse criticism, you've got the criticism because you haven't gone through a due process. And even when you do go through a due process, you still might be wrong on certain stuff, or not wrong, but something can be right one day and can change the next day. And then what you've put out there was not wrong at the time, but is there and ready to get absolutely destroyed. And I think we saw that with, I'm not going to name names, but there were various stories out there regarding Eric Ten Hag being sacked at the end of the season, even if he won the FA Cup. And then Eric Ten Hag won the FA Cup and ended up keeping his job. So you can imagine people are going to go back to that reporting, even if it was deemed to be stood up and correct at the time, and they're immediately going to make it very personal because it feels like the journalist is attacking their club. And I get a lot of, well, Ben Jacobs hates this club, Ben Jacobs is got an agenda, Ben Jacobs is pro this or pro that. And the reality is I'm not. I'm just trying to report with balance to the best of my ability, because a journalist shouldn't be pro one thing or pro the other. They should be impartial and balanced and take steps to go to all sides. But social media doesn't see it that way. So it is quite hard to handle, and you have to use the block button sometimes, and you have to realize that that person attacking you, even if it appears personal, probably is just a massive football fan under the age of 21 and annoyed by your news. So it can appear personal, but you have to learn to try and forget about that and depersonalize almost the trolls. So social media is there to bring us closer. And I do my best to use that to explain myself, to be accountable. I go on fan podcasts. I reply as much as I can. But by the same token, you have to go to the other extreme and almost take the social out of social media and say, well, if you are a bot, or if you are a young kid that's not prepared to name yourself, put a photograph in your profile, then I will just treat you almost as somebody that I'm not going to get sucked in by, and dehumanize you and take the social out of social media, which is a coping mechanism in order to deal with the fact that you do get a lot of criticism every single day.
I think like one of the things we encounter as men is this sort of presupposition that we must be strong, we must be in control of our emotions, and when the things you were sort of describing there were have kind of that ring to it. I guess like how, in terms of when you've had these things that affect you and you felt stuff, you felt negatively, and you felt those challenges. Are there particular things that you've done to combat that, or like aside from the sort of depersonalization of it, is there some kind of, do you have like a strategy for being more vulnerable and expressing your feelings?
I think coming off social media always helps for a little bit. It's difficult because you have to use it for work, and it's a strange one when it's professional, because if I was, and I would never be, but let's just presume wrongly and inaccurately and ridiculously that I'm some popular, amazing supermodel. And the only reason that people like me is because I'm some popular, amazing supermodel. Then my social media presence would be very much about people wanting to follow me for me and understand what I've had for breakfast or where I'm shooting next. And then if there was criticism, it might be harder to take. And I'd love to hear the perspective of someone in that sort of position. But for me, people care about my news, not Ben Jacobs. And if my news is accurate and they trust me, you can get a lot of praise. And that can feed into the ego and become quite addictive as well, by the way. But alternatively, if there is an issue, It's about my information and my professional reputation that can be attacked. And every journalist finds that, however good you are. So I don't really have that anyone cares about me, my life, my dog, where I am, where I'm traveling. They only care about the news. So you're caught in a very difficult position in that context, because if you want to switch off, you're also not doing your job, because there's a requirement within journalism to put things out there, to broadcast, and to use social media as well.
Yeah.
But there are coping mechanisms. One is I confront, and if somebody calls me out, I become accountable, and I do sometimes engage with them as long as they're respectful. The second thing is the block button. So if you're just going to abuse me, I'll block you. And then deep down, I'll have the last laugh, because there'll come a point where I report on your team and you've abused me out of passion or anger, and then you won't see my feed anymore. And maybe the next week I'll break something that could be really exciting to you and you won't learn about it. So blocking is one tactic. And then education is another. I think people need to understand what they should and shouldn't do, or can and can't do. And if you're not going to say it to my face, because you realize as a human being that if you said those words to my face, it would not be appropriate, then why would you say it online? And I think that as this new generation comes through and uses social media for the first time, we need to make sure that they understand that. And obviously the social platforms have to moderate and regulate in a way too. So it's not just about how I cope, it should be about how X and Instagram and TikTok cope, to make sure that we don't get in this situation where anybody can be constantly abused. And with the boxing at the Olympics in Paris, it was a good example where there was this big debate and furore about people commenting on the Algerian boxer without necessarily knowing the facts, without knowing the context. And it became a bigger issue around gender, with a lot of people commenting who were just not informed. And as a journalist, we're trained to be informed. And that's the thing that frustrates me the most in all of this, that my whole job is around, don't say something, whether right or wrong, unless you're confident in your sources and you've done your research. And then when I put it out there, half of the replies are ill-researched, are factually incorrect, and are abusive. So you almost have to laugh and smile and switch off and go for a dog walk. And away from things like social media and work, that's what I do. If I need to switch off, I'll say, okay, you know what? It's not worth it. If I am to revisit this, if I am to respond, I'm going to do it on my terms and my timescale. So I'll put some music on, I'll cook dinner, I'll go for a dog walk, I'll speak to friends, I'll go and see the family, and I'll almost force myself to do the life part rather than the work part. And then the emotion is diffused. And then if I need to come back to it and feel that I should respond, or feel that I'm going to continue using social media, or just get sucked back into a busy day of work, I've at least given myself some personal time, which I think is not only important for that work-life balance, but to diffuse any situation where you might do or say something based upon passion or anger or bait. And just taking that little breather and reminding yourself that life is bigger than the job that we just do is very important.
I love that. And just as we start to wind down, Ben, you're in one of those jobs where I think a lot of people listening might be like, that's a cool job, but that's way out of reach. That's an impossibility to get to. What's your advice to anyone listening who would love to be a sports broadcaster, a sports journalist? What's your advice for them to kind of start their journey to doing what you do?
I think, like I said before, there is no journey, so it can appear a very tricky career to get into, and it's more competitive every year. So that's the challenge. But there's more platforms out there and things that you can do. So practically speaking, decide what you want to do if you're going through the education system. And that could either be an arts degree and then maybe a journalism MA, or a journalism course. And journalism, when I was coming to university, to get on the course, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, the profession or any of the courses, but it was 3Ds, whereas my English Oxford requirements were 3As for A-levels. Now it's not the case. Now journalism is run by credible organisations. It's an incredible experience. You leave with a whole year that are going to likely go into the same industry. You have lots of strings to your bow. You try things, so you understand before you even graduate if you want to go into the career. And therefore, I would thoroughly recommend some kind of endorsed journalism course, whether you do that at undergrad or postgrad. That's the first thing. The second thing is play to your strengths. Because as I said earlier, anybody young has got a different skill set. They're learning things in different ways. If you go to the generation above me, they were shorthand. And now it's AI. And people don't even really need that ability. So as the industry evolves, if you're young, you're at an advantage in many ways because you might know how to film or edit or use social media or platforms and skill sets that, to be perfectly honest with you, the generations above might struggle with. We have to reinvent ourselves. Young people are just starting. So use that to your advantage. And there's a lot of young people out there that have got their own platforms. So get yourself published, whether it's on a Substack and your own blog, make your own TikTok, try and get the practical experience. And if you've got it, you've got it. So nobody's really ageist. If you bring a big story, then nobody says, sorry, we're not taking it because you're only 18 years of age or 21 years of age. And in the transfer world, even more so. If you're a young journalist looking to get into transfers, you're the same age as the players. And that's a big advantage. So go and make friends with players. I'm sure everyone's got a family connection. Work out who's in your generation and who you know. And generally speaking, players like people like to hang out with people their own age. So maybe that helps you get a story. And again, if you break the story, you gain credibility. And on top of that, I would say in life, rather than only the route in, because these are all the practical things, get a degree or get practical experience, use your own platform. It's reasonably commonplace and universal advice, certainly in the media, and it helps. Then more broadly, I would say don't come in with a preconceived path. Be prepared for, in inverted commas, failure, but don't look at failure as failure. Look at failure as a learning and realize that in hindsight, the older you will look back at the younger you and realize that eventually you get where you need to be. But the younger you can sort of set you back if you become too downbeat or too disillusioned or too impatient with trying to get where you need to be. You'll learn more from the negatives, you'll learn more from the failures, you'll learn more from the disappointments than you probably will be in terms of the highs. And that is equally as important too. And then try and enjoy it, which I know sounds like a ridiculous thing to say when you've just graduated, you're broke, you don't know where you need to be, you are thinking about many things happening in your life all at the same time. But you got to have these pinch me moments. And I know that it might sound a bit privileged to say, oh, enjoy your job, love your job, smile at your job, because thousands of people in the world can't. They have to take a job out of necessity. But again, I'm only speaking specifically about sports. So I have full respect for people that say, well, we had a family and the job was out of necessity, or I took the most well-paid job because finances were important, but I don't enjoy it, or I don't enjoy my job, but I'm unemployed, I've had hardship, I've not had opportunity, I've had to go in a different direction. I get that. And again, coming back to what we said before, we have to understand that and give people opportunities. And there are great things in sport, either done through football clubs like internships, or BComs by Leon Mann is one that I'd like to shout out, which is a fantastic opportunity for those that are eligible. And he does wonderful things, equal playing field for gender equality. So there are ways around it. But generally speaking, if you specifically go in my industry, and you're standing at Chelsea Football Club watching the players train, if you're not smiling doing that and privileged to be there, and then if you're not looking to raise the generation below, and if you're not looking to work out how everyone else can get that smile on their face and go out of your way to make others coming up feel inclusive, there's a very bad habit of feeling like journalists are competitive. So if someone's coming up, we need to push them down because what if they take my job? What if they take my story? And there's an element of that because we're all chasing after the same story. But we all have to breathe and realize that you only live once, we think, who knows? And hopefully we live more than once and get lots of great opportunities to smile and laugh and experience things in life. But as far as we're aware, we live once. So if you're standing there at that peak, that Champions League final, or that moment in your career, and they may be little moments. It might be the first time you get an opportunity, it might be the first time you get a one-on-one with a player, it might be the first time someone introduces themselves, it might be the first time you feel you've made a contact, it might be the first time you get a press release in your inbox and you think, okay, they've added me to the media list. For me, it was things like the first time I got a BBC email and I was like, well, this is really cool. You have to be able to stop at that point and not be like, oh, I'm tired, oh, I'm bored, oh, I'm stressed, someone else is doing something better than me. And journalists have a nasty habit of comparing themselves to others, other stories, other outlets, other people. Maybe we all do it in life, but my advice, along with the practical stuff that I've given about how you actually get into the industry, is back yourself, smile, try not to have this inferiority complex, take it moment by moment and realize you'll get where you need to be, but your path might not be that orthodox. And most importantly, don't be afraid to contact, because so many people want to be journalists. And when I speak to them, they've never had the guts, maybe, and I don't mean guts in a sort of man up way. I mean guts in the sense of take a shot because you miss 100% of the shots that you miss. They've never had that feeling of approach me in the same way that you approach me to do this podcast. And most journalists might appear quite difficult to get a response from, because what if they're busy? What if I annoy them? What if they're elsewhere? What if they don't want to help because they see me as a threat? But I can tell you from experience that everyone that's come to me or many of my colleagues for advice, we realize how hard it is, and we are very forthcoming, and we do want to help, and we do want to raise up the next generation. But when I go into universities and speak to younger wannabe journalists, they're almost scared of us, which is like really weird, right? Because we've spoken on this podcast about how when I was young, there was this fear and inferiority and imposter syndrome. And you get to a certain age, and one thing that doesn't change is that. So I can't compute in my mind that I'm intimidating to somebody because they're now looking at me as like the adult who's established, because I still see myself as my younger self. So if someone comes to me for advice or help, I go out of my way, and people are often surprised. And it's not me winning brownie points, and it's not me doing anything I wouldn't have done years back. But I'm always a little bit taken aback by how much courage it takes for somebody to come to someone older than them, me in this case, and ask for help and ask for advice. So if I can impart one bit of semi-wisdom for a middle-aged white man, it would basically be that if you think somebody can help you in or outside of sport and profession, then ask. And it might be tough and it might be scary, and you might feel like you're asking for humble pie if you're asking for help in other areas, mental health, for example, but talk about it. And if you feel there's someone in life that can help you, regardless of who they are or what they do, ask them. And my experience is 99 times out of 100 that asking will be one of the most beneficial things that you've done in life.
Love that.
No.
Beautiful way to finish it off. Thank you. Thank you for rambling. It's been an absolute pleasure listening
That's
to
what
you.
a podcast should be.
Absolutely. And I'm put onto Google to Google elephant polo. That's my next step. So.
Wonderful. Well, Ben, thank you, and good luck with the next 10 days.